right, another podcast from the Michigan Institute of Athletics in Brighton, Michigan. It's going to be a stellar podcast today. Right before I get into it, I want to shout out VetLife. VetLife is a 501c3 nonprofit company. It's a company of veterans for veterans. Every veteran faces difficulties when they transition from active duty back to civilian life, and VetLife is there to ease that transition. If you want to reach out to VetLife, you can do so through Instagram or Facebook, or check out their website at vetlifetoday.org. So without further ado, I want to introduce the guest that we have today. I'm super excited for this episode, Eric Fretz. I've heard a ton about you from Josh Parrish. He says that you're one of the few people that he considers to a mentor to him. He said you've taught him, excellent lessons along the way. You've had great dialogues. So without stealing any of your thunder, because I've read the bullet points of your accomplishments and they're extremely impressive. Before we introduce that part of your career, I want to take the guests all the way back. I want to know, where were you born and raised? Did you grow up here in Michigan? What were you like as a young man? What was your family life like? And then let's start to create your story.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I was born and raised around Washington, D.C. in the Maryland suburbs. We started out in a tiny little town called Calverton. And I think to understand me, you kind of have to understand my dad. And the real brief thing on him is that he was a very poor young man when he was 13 years old. His father passed away in rural Pennsylvania, and he was the youngest of three siblings, and he was the man of the house at 13 in the 50s when that really meant something still. And he had a very tough life with really no shot at anything. And he got very lucky because he had a high school counselor who let him take the advanced classes, the college classes that they normally would never have routed him into. And they did that because he was tutoring those kids successfully. And my dad was like, well, why can't I take those classes? And they're like, okay, sure, Bruce, you can take the college classes. Everybody knowing as the poor kid, he was never going to leave town. And then he got crazy lucky, and there was an African-American man who was quite wealthy in Philadelphia who had created scholarships for fatherless boys. And that's what sprung my dad out of what was kind of a dead-end life. And he went to college, and he became a psychologist, and he did everything his whole life basically as I appreciate now. Once I had my own, you never understand your parents till you have your own kids, and now I understand that the stuff that I found so annoying about my upbringing was him trying to make sure that I had everything that he didn't, and that I was positioned so that I could sort of take on whatever I wanted to take on. And so all the extra work that he made me do as a kid that I thought was just annoying, I realized what a debt I owed. So anyway, that was how that began. We were in this a nice community in Prince George's County, and then he moved us to Montgomery County. And again, didn't understand that as a kid. Why do I have to leave my friends? But he put us in one of the top school districts in the nation. And so here I was at Thomas S. Wooten High School in Rockville, Maryland, which to this day, that school is still top 100 schools in the nation kind of thing. Sent 98% of its kids to college in the 80s. Unheard of. And I had the access to these fantastic teachers and this incredible education. But I really didn't appreciate it much. I was kind of a jerk as a student. I was not super motivated. I really loved Boy Scouts, and I loved leadership. I loved helping groups of people get to a goal. And so most of my adult mentors were like, look, bro, if this is what you like, the place that you get paid to lead and lead well under pressure is the military. And I thought, oh, military. And there'd been no tradition of military service in two levels in all directions of my family tree. There was none of that. And so my family was a little puzzled by that, but I went for an ROTC scholarship and ended up going to the University of Michigan. So that's how I first came to the Midwest. And once I came to Michigan, that really was, I was really impressed by it. I enjoyed everything about it, from the climate to just everything that was available in Michigan, and made some great friends here. Loved Ann Arbor, the Detroit area, everything. So that was my adopted home. I really considered Michigan home as of my arrival. Really, it wasn't like I was trying to escape my hometown, but it wasn't anything really holding me there. It was all about creating a new adventure, and Michigan and the Navy was it. So that was the beginnings, and that's how I came to sort of be in Michigan. And I spent most of my time in the Navy for 20 years, active and reserve, traveling all over the globe. Never did find any place I liked better than Ann Arbor. So now I'm back, and we built a house on the Huron River, and honestly, it's about as good as it could be, I think.
So you grew up in a home where, I mean, your father came from kind of a broken home or a ton of responsibility, all this stuff thrown onto him, but
Yeah.
you grew up in a home full of love. You grew up in a home
Hmm.
where your father tried to do everything in his power to give you the life that he didn't have,
Yeah.
but that he wished for his children, right?
Yeah.
So he wanted to empower you from a young age. And it's funny because the conversation that we were having before this podcast actually correlates in some ways that, your father was doing things for you that were in your best interest, that was for your future, giving you all that he could. But at the time, you couldn't see that in every avenue and every choice, right? Because I was moved around multiple times as a child.
Yeah.
And you're going like, hey, these are my friends. You're ruining my life. You're making things harder for me. And your father is looking at the big picture going, no, I'm setting you up to have opportunities that I never had, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that you're able to live a successful life. And now being on the much later side of that, you can look back and see that and go, aha,
Yeah.
all right, Dad, I see what you were doing there. And now you're in a, like I said, in a way, what we were discussing earlier, you're kind of experiencing that with your children because you are trying to provide everything possible
Right.
for the life that you can give your daughter. How many kids do you have?
3.
You have 3 kids. So you're trying to give them this life, but to them, that's the only life they don't. They haven't put that in perspective yet.
Right.
They haven't seen, the sacrifice and the things you're making.
Yeah.
So you moved to the Midwest. It's a brand new chapter.
Yeah.
You liked it right off the bat. Did you have any goals before you went in the military about what did you think you were going to be? Did you ever have that like young kid, hey, I think I'm going to do this? Or when military, when the opportunity came in front of you, was that like, what, this is my moment?
It was one of those things where I knew that was the route I wanted to go, and then as I got more familiar with it and really started to immerse myself in the Navy and the Navy training, luckily there's an author who was really popular at the time, Tom Clancy, and he wrote these books. Obviously, most people know Hunt for Red October. There was another book called Red Storm Rising, which if you want to capture I don't want to call it paranoid, but the zeitgeist, the vibe of the 80s, it was a different thing. Like nuclear weapons, mutual assured destruction. We had finally stopped doing nuclear holocaust drills in the schools, but that was still in everybody's mind. There was a movie called The Day After, which was about a nuclear explosion on the East Coast. Everyone lived in terror of both nuclear war and the Russian monstrosity. This the USSR, the communists, they were going to take over the world. The Cold War dominated all of our thinking. And so this idea that the world needed to be saved was a big thing. And if you want to know what was sort of in my mind and the mind of most officer trainees back then, it would be the novel Red Storm Rising, which was this once that novel was published, a lot of people were very angry at Clancy because they felt he gave away military secrets, but he didn't. He just made a great story and used publicly available information. But it talked about how the Russians would come and try and take over Western Europe, and we would try and rush over there, and the Navy had to, surge across the ocean and clear the sea lanes and all of this big battle, and they would try and wipe out the carriers, and we would have this big naval battle to sort of for the supremacy of the seas. And that was the big thing, and I gotta tell you, that was in my mind all the time. That was my thing. I wanted to be in the Navy. I wanted to become a captain of a ship at sea. I wanted to defend my nation and help the world. It was such a drive. So that was my thing, and I really cared about that. I was an okay student at Michigan. I tell my students I'm blessed to be a faculty member there now, which I never would have believed if you told me this back in the 80s. But I tell my students now, if you want to have a bad time with me, do stuff that reminds me of when I was a student, because then you're going to get the grumpy version of me, because you're going to activate all that self-loathing I have about how poorly I performed as a student and how poorly I treated Michigan when I was here the first time. But I did get through, and I commissioned, went into the Navy, got done to my ship, went over for Gulf War I, ended up deploying to the Persian Gulf Combat Zone 3 times across 2 different wars. And so that area of the world just defined my whole military career. Yeah.
So when you were first going in, like you said, there's an ideological battle going on there in your mind between good and evil. Like that was the story we were being sold. Is it was like the commies and the red, they're coming to get you, they're going to harm you, we're in danger. So when there's a fight or flight response constantly, in the minds of every American, like where you're living in a fear of something that exists that maybe if you were actually there, like you see it very differently than a citizen sees it, or people that are deeply embedded in the culture are going to see it differently than just someone that's sitting at home every day with the television telling them like, hey, this nuclear war is coming, it's going to hit you, it's going to wipe out your family. When you first went over there, let's talk about this. I'm trying to paraphrase this correctly. Through your military experience, did the initial drive change? Like, did you start to see things differently as you were in the military? And then when you had gone to war multiple times, because now you are that fighter, you are the person
Right.
that is defending your nation from the evil that you believe exists. Did that ideology change over time? What
Yeah.
did you learn from war?
Yeah. I mean, that changed big time. Each phase, each time I went, it changed. The first one, I was on a ship in the Gulf, um, and it was right towards the tail end of Desert Storm, and we had essentially vanquished the world's largest Soviet proxy army in 100 hours. And I got to be honest, it wasn't just the whole world that was shocked. I mean, even in the military, we were like, oh, wow, that worked really well. And we totally wrecked their, right? Like, wow, that we're pretty good at this. And it was almost a little bit disturbing. We were like, that was almost ridiculously easy. What's going on? Because we it was sort of like you'd been prepping all this time to fight this huge ogre, and you get in there and you throw one roundhouse kick, and it's out. And you're like, well, that was it. We're done. And so, and then it had a very strange effect, not strange, a predictable effect, where military budgets, of course, I mean, the whole world saw this and sort of looked at the United States and said, okay, so yeah, you're in charge, and the wall came down. The Soviet Union just literally within a year or two just kind of melted away because everybody realized, like, well, now they're going to come and do that to us, and that was it. And so the military started shrinking, right? By the time I think I transitioned to the reserves in 96, 97. The military had already been cut like in half, right? And which was it was good play by President Clinton, right? You don't need all the guns, have more butter, right? And that was good for the country and the economy. But that was a huge change. It was like, oh, maybe this whole ginormous boogeyman thing wasn't as accurate, right? And I got to see for the first time some of the cultures over there and all the differences. And we were on the ship mostly, so I learned a lot more on the ground when I was like in Baghdad, Iraq for the last tour. That was a real eye opener in a different way because I was really culturally kind of immersed in learning a lot more. But yeah, that first one was an eye opener of like, oh, maybe the boogeyman was oversold, right? Yeah,
That's what I was thinking. And because we had that like big stick policy, remember? Like, and we wanted to show people, like, listen, we are going to be the force. And then all of a sudden, war is an ugly thing. Like, I mean, we should work to not have to destroy things to get a point across, right?
Yeah.
Now, like, war is something we should work actively as a healthy society and as a healthy, world to go against. So it's like you at first were in that fight to be like, hey, I'm fighting this boogeyman to protect people from evil.
Yeah.
But then you get over there, you experience it, and you go, oh, wait a second, we just crush them. Now all of a sudden, it's a different story, and you can
Yeah.
see that. Now, when you were being immersed in these cultures, because that's one of the things that I've experienced in my life. I've traveled all over the world, and I really see like people as people. Like Eric and James's exist all over this world. They have all different belief systems. They're of different social statuses,
Yeah,
but
100%.
they are just people pursuing their own happiness, and they have their version of the world. And in some people's versions that they're being taught from their childhood, it's that America is the big, red, scary,
way. Absolutely.
100%. And a lot of the times when you don't consider that, those children may view you as the big bad threat. And we have to work to change that. And so one of the things that I want to discuss is most military veterans that struggle when they transition out are struggling with what they experience in their mind from that breakdown in reality. Like they had a certain purpose, a certain cause, a certain belief for what they were going to be fighting for, and then the reality did not match that, and they struggle with that. Did you have that, or were you able to like keep a pretty level head during
Yeah.
the process of your military service?
Yeah, I mean, they often refer to that as something called moral injury, right? And it's this idea that you're having to hold something in your head about what you saw or what you did or participated in that doesn't fit with who you want to be as an integrated sort of human and how you view yourself. And that can be really injurious to people. Yeah, I didn't have a super big difficulty. I mean, I was kind of lucky in a way. I was deployed with no notice. This was during the surge. So I was, keep in mind, I was a Navy guy trained to fight ships and big sea battles and stuff. And so I really wasn't expecting it when in my last of my 20-year career, that last year, the Navy came to me and basically said, "Hey, yeah, we're gonna mobilize you, and we're gonna give you the Army. And we're gonna put you in Baghdad with the 18th Airborne Corps. Have fun, bye." And I was gone 21 days later. I mean, it was the most destructive thing. My wife was really upset. My children were absolutely just distraught. And leaving them was probably one of the hardest things. I cannot, if I tried to tell you the story of the day I left, I would be a bawling mess. I wouldn't be able to continue the broadcast. So I just have to keep that compartmentalized. But that was a rough departure. And of course, at that time the economy was collapsing, so 50% of our accumulated wealth had disappeared. My father had a cardiac incident and he needed open heart surgery, and he said to me, "Well, I'm not going to get the surgery till you come home alive from Iraq." Dad, oh my God. And I get over there to Iraq, and there's no real communication. You can't really get good links back. When I can get phone calls or video calls through, my son is so upset he won't talk to me. And so I'm just thinking, lose all our money. We're going to be bankrupt. My wife's going to leave me. My son will never talk to me again. My father's going to be dead. And then of course I'm the one Navy guy assigned to this Army unit. So I'm the outsider and kind of the stranger. That's fine. I'm a reasonably friendly guy. I have, I know how to work my way in, but it gets better. Then someone in this unit had lost some really expensive classified communications gear. And the colonel in charge of the unit turns to me and says, "Okay, you're going to be my investigating officer." So what he does is he basically turns me into an IA. He turns me into an internal affairs cop in a unit I just joined, and then orders
As
them,
the only Navy
and
guy.
then orders them all to not talk to me and to not interact with me, so that I don't bias my investigation. And because of course I could fry somebody. And so I gotta tell you, and then of course on top of that, people are just shooting at you and trying to kill you all the time. And so I gotta tell you, that was not a good time. And and I don't mean to, I was on a pretty well developed base, and I was not I'm not some door kicker. I'm not watching my friends get cut down. And I know there's a lot of people who I serve beside out there who were carrying a lot heavier burden than me. But I gotta tell you, what I was carrying and how far down the rabbit hole I was, I never ever want to go back down that hole. And the fact that my experience was relatively routine, and so many were taken so much further. Like you mentioned earlier, this it's so funny until I think maybe it's one of those things. Until you go and experience it, war in the abstract can seem like a game or can seem like fun, and then once you actually touch it, once it actually gets in your mouth, you spit it out and you're like, "Oh, the hell with that. That is the worst thing ever," right? But I think you have to actually taste it to really understand that.
And now you're a man that when you got pulled back over, you are already viewing things very differently than you probably would have been at 18 years old. You have a family, you have all these responsibilities. You get pulled back over. You're also in a different psychological state than an 18-year-old kid that's thrown into that environment. You know what I mean? Like, you've seen more of the world. You've seen ups and downs. You've reframed perspective.
Better resources, better structure to take that stress.
You're at a higher level. Like you said, you're not the door kicker that witnesses. A gentleman that was just on the podcast 4 days ago, or last week actually, watched a 6-year-old get shot in the chest in front of him, bleed out and die as he tried to keep him alive, and he was literally a door kicker inventory. And listening to that man talk about the traumas that he had gone through, like, you could see in his eyes how deeply his soul was affected by that stuff. You know what I mean? You were struggling with all that, but still at like a way different point in life, in your position, etc. So when you come back, how long were you over there for?
A whole year.
So you're over there a year. You come back, your wife's still there. You still got your family.
Yeah, it all worked out. It was kind of miraculous in a way, but it was still a real challenge. I wasn't. You would think that I would be smarter as a psychologist, and I'm not. My discipline is not there's a wide range of psychology, but there's 50 divisions of APA. Only 2 of them actually do mental health care, right? But so not being a clinical specialist, it's fine. But still, you would think I would be smarter and sort of recognize the need, to get some help, because I definitely wasn't okay. And and the system is, as there's other people have probably mentioned, when you're done, when you come back from a deployment, you get right there to the cusp of going back to your old life, and they put this form in front of you and they say, "How are things?" And you have all these little check boxes, right? But you know that if you check the checkbox and speak honestly about how you're not sleeping well, you're angry all the time, or you can't control your emotions, and if you check any of that, they're going to pull you from the demobilization thing, and they're going to put you over here with the psychologist, and you're not going to get to see your family for who knows how long. And so the system is set up to gather faulty data and to not really, what they really should be doing is they should force everybody to just go have an evaluation for like an hour. Right? That's what they should be doing. Because I did the same thing as everybody else, and I was really struggling. I would be out on a run, I would start crying, and I didn't know why, and I couldn't stop. When I got home, I would lose my ability to regulate emotionally when I would be dealing with my children. I could recognize that I was starting to not be a good dad, so I then would stop and I would say, well, we're going to stop this conversation. I'm going to go to the basement. So I had enough control to avoid really doing damage. But for over a year, I was not the father and not the husband that I could have and should have been. So,
Can you put a finger on why exactly that was? Like, because you are a man that understands psychology. You're very intelligent. You're at a higher rank. Like you said, you didn't have the direct. But what was like the actual demon or the thing that still, no matter what, tormented you like that? Because
yeah.
it's like the biggest thing that day you were leaving that like you said, is still compartmentalized. You don't even want to talk about how painful that day was. You would think from the outside, the moment you can reestablish that you just go back to like, thank God, I'm like, here's my
Yeah.
life,
Turn the lights back on, open
100%. But it's never like that.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
Well, I'd say it's two things. From a psychology standpoint, you can look, you can see this. They've done studies on it. You can take you scan, take a neurotypical human who's pretty well adjusted, okay life, and then you give them a scan, normal brain scan, great. Take them and put them in. Combat's a good example, but there's others. Some kind of environment where it's super stressful, super risky. You feel personally imperiled and unsafe. You feel, maybe you have a boss that's really hostile. So basically put them someplace where their stress reaction is getting triggered every damn day, over and over and over again.
That fight or flight.
So you're just hitting the nitrous over and over, and you're just grinding this engine up. And after 6 to 9 months of this, you can then scan this brain, and it will no longer look neurotypical. It will be a much closer match to the brain scan of an individual who is literally institutionalized for long-term chronic depression. So I knew in the abstract this was true, but what Iraq really taught me, what my final deployment taught me, was toxic leadership and toxic environments can literally create mental health issues in otherwise healthy individuals. And that really blew me away. So my brain chemistry had been distorted under this pressure to turn me into a mildly depressed individual that didn't have as many of the resources. A lot of stuff had been taken away from me because things were bent and not working correctly. And then I think the other piece was just I don't know how to describe it. The other piece was an inability, because that's that part is just across the board. And then there was the more specific thing where when you really have, prior to Iraq, people would talk about being depressed, or people would kill themselves, and you would think, and I think this is true for a lot of people, so I don't say this as an accusation, because this was literally me up until 2008, was, they were weak, or they didn't have the right character, or they gave up. They were predisposed to being quitters, and they just didn't focus on the positive or something. Because if you've never been pushed across that line, it doesn't make any sense. But once you are across that line and you are laying in a bed in Mississippi, and you know that you have to get up, you have to put on your uniform and shave and go get this paperwork, and then go get on a plane and go home. And you're done, like you've succeeded, you've won, right? You get to go home, everything's right there for you, and you're laying in this bed, and you can't get up. And it's like there's this thing inside you that is just telling you that everything is wrong and that nothing has any value. And I remember fighting with it, and I remember almost objectively like staring at it, being like, what is this fog, this creature, this thing? You're wrong. I have a family to go home to. But it wasn't wrong, because that thing controlled my feelings. Like, I don't know what that was, but I never want to experience that again, because it was like you couldn't even count on your own brain. It wasn't yours anymore. And so and it would come and go. So sometimes it was overwhelming, and then after, if it just, I could somehow force myself to get going, I could manage for the rest of the day, and then it would surge again later. And it went like that for over a year. But it's the amplitude was slowly becoming less. And so I knew that if I knew that I had 100 pounds on me today, but it would be 99 tomorrow, and I ground out. But that was really eye opening, because at that point I realized, like, boy, if you turn that back up to the highest point it was, and you ran me and you put that on me 24 hours a day, I don't think I'd make it a month. I don't think I'd make it a month. And that's a thing. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's why they do it. Because it's not a choice. It's not a choice. You can't bear it.
Now you have a level of empathy that you
Yeah.
never had before. You're able to
Yeah.
see someone, and because you see them as you remember that moment, and you go like, wow, I can understand that thing.
Yeah.
And you went over something profound there, like a neurotypical brain exposed to this environment long enough will become different. It will change, you know what I mean? And it's that stress or fight or flight. Now, one of the things you said that I want to go into a little more is you said a toxic leadership or an environment can do this to you. But in something like war, how could you ever really avoid that? Because you're going to be in that environment. I think even if you had great leaders and great mentors, just the aspect of war itself, you're witnessing one of the ugliest sides of humanity. I would almost think that based on your assessment, that it is always going to yield this type of effect. Now, we may have to find a way to cope with the effect better treatment options, better, like you said, evaluations for every single person that, whether they want to hide it from you or not, there is work to be done there. You know what I mean? And like, obviously, we would both probably like to live in a utopian world where there is no more war, there is no more conflict, there isn't. But unfortunately, these things may still exist. Would you agree with those statements?
I would totally. And the Army's put a ton of research, the military in general, the Army especially, has put a ton of research into what they are calling resiliency. But it's this desperate attempt to try and understand, why does it affect some people so much more than others? Because you can look at a platoon, they're just a group of, take 10 guys, same background, came from the same general areas, rural areas, whatever, did the same training, got the same exposure, were in the same unit, went to the same town, fought in the same battles. And you literally will see 3 or 4 for whom that experience essentially ends their lives from who they were. They'll either literally end their lives, or they will collapse into a sort of a pit of dysfunction that they never get out of. A couple others will be average, they'll come back, they'll be fine. But then there will be others who experience what we call PTG, post-traumatic growth. They actually become stronger for their service. And I would see this up front and personal. Post-surge, when I was at the University of Michigan, I continued to work heavily with the student veteran community there. And that was a lot of them come back, and we're coming right out of combat roles. And there were some that were so dysfunctional, it was so stressful, because these individuals were just absolutely struggling to meet even the basic obligations of their day. And then there are others who are absolutely killing it. They're triple majoring, becoming president of the student veterans group, handling all this additional stuff, and just killing it. And they had walked almost the same path. And how do you figure out how do you do that? That I don't think they've got figured out. I mean, the one thing you can say for sure is making people stay in that environment for 15 months is insanity, right? I mean, the Air Force limits these tours to 3 to 6 months. I think that's a lot healthier. I think if you looked at the data, I would bet a lot of money that the Air Force sees far fewer problems. I think that the Army and the way that they did things, you had to do it, but boy, oh boy, it's a cumulative wear and tear process. And in our 13th month, we lost the only soldier my unit lost, and we lost him to suicide. Right? And it just makes my skin crawl now, because we heard the shot and we just assumed it was another, right? Because you're just always hearing gunfire. You can imagine that. You hear it, you think nothing of it, you wake up the next morning and he's gone. And it was just shocking to me, right? Like you always look back and you're like, oh, it seemed like he was kind of getting more and more worn down, but we all were, right? And oh my gosh, why didn't he? Why didn't we?
I would agree with you 1000% that there are methods that we could look at if we are bringing this this topic to conversation, and we're really breaking this down about like how long you should keep somebody in complex situations. You should rotate people through. You should have different units. You should have different mental health services on hand. You should have different systems that help the individual experience something that really is very foreign to most people. So when you put them in this environment, they're not ready for it. I would also think, and I could be completely wrong, but when I'm hearing you break down like why did these kids make it and these kids didn't, I bet you it has a lot to do with what trauma and damage has hit their lives already. Like at a young age, my mother committed suicide, and I had a girlfriend of 2.5 years who I was like very in love with, who was like the first person I really opened up to and confided in, because I went from being a very depressed kid, teenage love, like 15, 16. You think like, I'm like, oh, this is the girl for me. Yeah. But she was the first person that I was like, man, this is who I really am. This is me past the pain, past the loneliness, past. My parents moved me to Michigan due to circumstances, and that girl took her life. She was a depressed kid too. We tried to make a long distance relationship work. So 2.5 years, she took her life. And I remember getting to such a pit and such a low, such an emptiness, contemplating my own suicide countless times. But something happened when I came out of that, and I developed a level of resiliency that has allowed me to, like, what would crush most people doesn't even pass like this barrier that I now have. And the weird thing is I'm actually able to connect way deeper and more compassionately and with more empathy for struggling human beings because I remember being there. So just because, I think we have to realize as the people looking at this data, just because someone grew up in the same town or serves in the same unit or deploys to the same combat, that has nothing to do with the inner workings of the mind. That's not Billy and John. They're both white or black or none of it's the mind. Like, we could grow up in the same household, but through our experiences have a tremendously different perspective of the world based on what we've had. You know this as a psychologist. So I think that it comes down more to being aware of the psychological states of the people that we're dealing with, and it's a more hands-on approach. A one blanket fits all solution, like, oh, well, these people from a rural town and they should be fine. We're not going to solve the problem. We have to almost look at, I love the words that you said, and I don't know much about it. I'd like to ask you about it. You said resiliency training is something the military is doing. But how do you create resiliency for such a deep, like, soul impacting thing, like watching your friend commit suicide?
Yeah, I mean, you almost can. I mean, all you can do is say, you can note what things the research says are what we would say prophylactic, or are they help prepare or blunt it, almost like in a video game sense. You can grab this thing and you can plus up your armor by 1, and then you can grab this other thing and plus it up by 2.
You're an RPG player. I've been wanting to ask you after the podcast, because you've made so many references when you said an ogre and you've said plus the stats. I'm like, this guy plays either World of Warcraft or EverQuest, or he's a gamer.
I do. I actually play a lot of StarCraft. That's my thing. But I have a lot of friends that play the other games. But yeah. So then if you say, okay, like if I want to do this, what are the things I could tick them off, right? So I could maintain reasonable physical health, right? I could be reasonably physically active. That helps. I could get outside a decent amount, and get enough sunlight and expose myself to nature. I could have a meditation or mindfulness practice where I can engage in regular meditation and basically be able to have a better understanding of my internals, be able to still myself, be able to understand, my emotional states rather than feeling that it's unregulated. This sense of control, and just several other things. I think we've hit some of the big ones. So you tick those things off. In the military, one of the things I think the Israelis were pushing this was, as long as you train people, the better trained they are, the less anxiety and the less destructive some of the. It's not that combat is easier. It's that it's harder when you're not trained and more experienced. And so that would argue to sort of try to give as much realistic training as possible, right, before you send somebody to that environment.
This actually makes sense. You're strengthening, first of all, their confidence in self. And by doing so with their training and all these other methods, the experience that is going to be difficult gets the volume turned down a little bit. As you were saying that, it makes perfect sense. If you take someone that trains every day for violent physical confrontation, whether through kickboxing or jiu-jitsu, mixed martial arts, in a setting where there's likely to be violence, they are much more controlled. They're not as emotional, about to freak out. It doesn't impact them. Let's say they did get in a very violent altercation. To them, it doesn't register so deeply because on a regular basis, they are going through these experiences. So it's almost like you're conditioned for them in some messed up degree.
Or recalibrated. I use this phrase a lot with my veterans, is that you have been recalibrated, whether you like it or not. So you have to understand this, because I'll often tell them, I have certain phrases, and my students learn certain phrases from me, and the veterans. One of them I always encourage them is never go full vet, because they internalize all these weird habits and these weird beliefs, and they take a certain amount of macabre humor at certain things because you almost have to stay sane. But then you come back to the real world, and I asked them, I say, let's say you came out of a mire and there was a man that may or may not have had a weapon in his hand. It might be a stick or something. And he was yelling and acting angry and hostile. And he was walking amongst the cars and making a lot of noise and just being weird and threatening. What would you do? And then they would generally say something like, well, I would keep several cars between me and him. I would walk to my car. I would maybe keep an eye on things, make sure he wasn't hurting anybody. Maybe I would call it into the police, depending, and then I would drive away. And I said to him, would it really impact your day? Would you maybe even mention it to anybody? That, no, probably not. I said, I need you to understand that every other citizen who encountered that situation, that's the most stressful thing they've ever experienced in their entire lives. And they will talk about it for weeks. They were that meter went to 4 for them that day. The problem is that your boot camp was 5. Right, and your first unit was 6, and your deployment was 7, and getting shot at was 8, and shooting back was 9. So as a veteran, you've had your meter just reclocked all the way out to where you understand how this goes, and so now a 4 doesn't even produce a reaction. And so, but the real problem is, though, you can't be doing 5 and 6 level stuff for funsies around people whose meter only goes to 4, or you're going to blow their minds, and they're going to be very upset with you.
100%. But that analogy, as you were saying, it makes so much sense. And it's you have to recognize that your perception of the world can be extremely different than someone else's. Like the depression I've struggled with, I might know somebody else that has never really experienced a tough time. So when their dog is sick, to them that is a traumatic experience. They are literally broken down in pieces, unable to function. But your perception is your reality. And a veteran, has their worldview stretched so much more than the average person, or people that have battled with deep suicide or trauma or things like this. Your worldview is stretched. But what you have to realize is, just because yours is stretched does not mean that the other individuals you are interacting with is stretched. Yeah. You know what I mean? And that level of compassion and realizing like other people may consider that differently will help be a healthier functioning version of yourself, right? Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I think that you also touched on that is so massive for these conversations about, you had said before, before I redeployed, I looked at people that were suicidal or stuff, and I had this idea of like, oh, they were just weak or they couldn't figure it out. What I think a lot of people don't understand is, regardless of how your brain thinks, and you'll know this 100%, the limbic system, the way that you feel, really drives everything. So even if you're laying in that bed thinking to yourself, I should get up, I have my family there, my life is okay, that experience is over. When you are battling that demon, that limbic system, making you feel this emptiness, this pit, regardless of what information you are being given, until that feeling starts to subside, or you get another spark that fills your spirit, or like, even if it's just the potential of a better future. Like a lot of the times with the core kids that I work with, these kids that are at the very, very bottom, I'm just trying to light a spark again for them to think that the future might be better. Yeah. Not even that it will be, because they don't believe that yet. Yeah. I'm just
a sliver of light that they can see and walk towards, right?
Like there is a doorway that's out there that if you can open, there is a better future on the side of it. Because what I realize is, if I tried to break down philosophy or information or show resources, if you can't affect the emotions that they're dealing with or give them a grain of hope, they're not going to change. And I'm sure you've experienced this as well, because as a very logical thinker, someone that can break down information, you're laying there in bed, I could hear it on your story going, just get up, just do this. But unfortunately, as human beings, exactly, your brain is going, nope, sorry, doesn't register, chief. Try again with that one later. So I think we need to be better at realizing that like people's emotional battles can be so different than what you may think based on your perception. And it could help like soften the world a little bit, is where I was going with this. If you had more people at home that realize like, you might think to yourself, like, if they would just get up and get a job, they'd get back in society, or if they would just go back. And then that puts an even bigger pressure on the person because they probably know that too.
Yep.
But when you're deeply in those moments, you almost just need compassion. You need someone to be there for you if you need them. You need people to try to create spark in your spirit again. You know what I mean? Like, and this is a conversation I think we need to be having with veterans, and I'm sure you do with your students. Would you agree with these things?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that I think it's important for those individuals with that kind of issue, and it's even applicable more broadly because one of the biggest things I try and get my kids to do on campus is to sort of open their eyes to this idea. I teach them this specific phrase: different is not the same as wrong, is not the same as evil. And I just have this different, unequal sign, wrong, unequal sign, evil. And I ask them if they think back, and most of them will admit that in the previous week or two, they've had at least one instance where they pole vaulted across that entire arc because somebody said a word that identified them as the wrong political tribe, and therefore they have the wrong political beliefs, and therefore they're evil. And this is just a mess. It's back to the point you made at the start about how people everywhere are just people trying to when I in the midst of everything in Iraq, I'm sitting here working with some of these Iraqi special forces soldiers building a scout camp of all things, and I'm realizing these dudes, they just want to get food for their kids. They want their kids to be safe. They want the exact same things that I do. They're just in a system that isn't set up as well to provide it, right? So that, like, literally their number one concern every day is, where can I find water? And literally, right, like, this is a modern, this is we're not in the 5th century, and they're literally wondering where the water is. Whereas you come back to America, there's nobody in the United States, hardly anywhere, even the most impoverished, who doesn't have clean water on tap almost for as much as they want, right? So anyway, it blew my mind, like this, that everybody wants that same thing. And so all these people who you think are like so politically awful, if you just sat down next to them at a restaurant, started having a conversation, you could be best friends. It would come up later on that maybe you voted for different people, but that's after you've discovered 20 things where you're the same.
100%. And I'm a little spoiled in this gym because I have people that are the furthest left leaning friends, and I have people that are the furthest right leaning friends. And when they come into the building, they treat each other with respect. They're kind to one another. They train martial arts together. And even if they have a difference of opinion, they are human beings first with opinions second. And really, if we get to a point where like you said, we are pole vaulting. I love that analogy that you just gave. Like, I try to tell people all the time, like, a liar can tell the truth. Someone that claims to always tell the truth can tell a lie. You can't just naturally throw these labels on things like Republican evil, Democrat good, Democrat evil, because you are missing the human being and you're completely closing off lines of communication. Versus if we go, hey, these dialogues might be difficult. They might be challenging. They might invoke a little bit of emotion. But as human beings, when we work together and communicate, we are more successful at producing better futures, results, etc., tribes, communities, whatever you'd want to call it, right? Whereas you have people now, I think it's just to make the mind simpler. Oh, they're this, they must be that. You got to get away from that. You got to get back to the idea of take things step at a time, right? Because like you said, it's a pole vault. It's jumping to a conclusion. There's one other thing that you touched on earlier about the training versus response to situation versus like the level that it registers on, that you can even see in current events, like with policing. You had police brutality is a terrible thing. You have movements for defund the police. You saw the Minneapolis Police Department get burned to the ground. You saw people supporting that. You saw people against that. No matter what, you do have to realize that these are people that could be put in extremely tense, difficult situations where lives are going to be on the line. And it's like, do I shoot this person? Do I not? Do I get shot? What can we do? Because bad situations are going to come up. We can provide better training. We can get these people to realize that, like, okay, my weapon should be my absolute last resort. But for my body to respond correctly and not have fight or flight and fear envelop me, have me instantly reach for my gun because I feel like it's life or death, I need to have really good communication skills, really good knowledge of the law and the information on it, really good ability to be compassionate during the exchange. You might be having the worst day of your life when you get pulled over. You might be the worst Eric that's ever existed for that quick moment in time. You, no matter what, unless you're trying to kill the officer, you do not deserve to lose your life on that day. So the more training we provide for like, and this is just one example across society based on this topic. Police, to communicate, to be effective, to even be safe in their own body, like to have hand-to-hand combat training. Like if I had a gun, I would be way less likely to shoot someone because like I have done jujitsu for 18 years. I'm incredibly effective at controlling human beings. If you try to grab a hold of me, I'm like, oh, let's go. You know what I mean? But we need to realize that like to solve some of these super difficult, painful topics in society, more and better training. And you know what that comes from? Dialogue. We have to talk about these things and then implement processes that can help. Is this something that you also see in our society?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it's so difficult too. Like one of the things that really brought home is we had to go through these shoot no shoot scenario trainers in these simulators that gave you basically laser weapons, and you were put in all these things. You were outside of a mosque, and a bunch of people come running up, and somebody throws something, and what is it? And do you shoot? Do you point your weapon? If you do point your weapon, do you fire? Somebody comes up and is all panicked, and he pulls something out, and it turns out to be, a guinea pig or something. But you shoot him, right? Because and the pressure, but of course sometimes someone will pop out from around a corner and kill half your team. And what these scenarios really showed me was just how difficult our job was going to be, but B, it really changed my empathy for policing because anybody who's going to, all the time you hear people say, well, why didn't they just choose non-lethal or something? I thought it would be very interesting if we had, I don't know where you would do this. It would almost be some sort of a weird business you'd have to open or something. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if in every state there was a place you could go where, and this would be maybe something cool that Bill Gates could do or something, but every state would have a place, be a building kind of like this, where you come in, you get suited up, and you put on a suit, and there's electrodes that will really painfully shock you all over your body, including places you wouldn't want shocked. And then you're all wired up, and then you're covered with laser sensors, and then you get a thing, and you go into a simulator, and you're forced to do what a policeman does. So first it would be video adversaries. Then it would be a guy like you, where I hire you to be 20 feet away, and I say, if he can draw and actually hit you, you'll be paralyzed you'll be tased. But if you can get to him first and get a weapon on him, you'll get. And in order to play the game, the person has to put 2% of their net worth. So if it's someone who's worth a lot of money, in order to play this game, they have to put a bunch of money in it. So if somebody actually gets to you and stabs you, you lose your money. But if you shoot them first and it's inappropriate, you lose your money. Or if they shoot you, you get electrocuted. It would be a way of having people have to experience a little bit of what the police do all the time because they want to do their jobs, but they also don't want to die.
1,000%. You know what it would do? It would give understanding for how incredibly difficult that situation is. Yeah. Because I feel like a lot of people that are sitting on the outside criticizing, being judgmental, I would have done this. You don't know that. First of all, you have no training, most likely. Yeah. You're saying what you would do. You'd probably panic if anyone raised their voice to you. Yeah. You know what I mean? So 100%. And I see that as well. And the more we can get people to back closer to reality, you've experienced a form of fight or flight and those quick moment decisions. So you have a different empathy. You know what I mean? Just like if you experience someone that's struggling, you have a different empathy. I went to Africa one time with one of our fighters. We went to Senegal, and people were literally dying on the side of the road without water. And I had never seen anything like that in my life. I had seen really bad parts of Brazil. I saw China, went there 4 times, 3 of the times. These people live in subhuman conditions. I can't quite describe to you how horrific it was.
They're human because they're alive and they're still there, but it's a level at which most Americans don't even really comprehend exists.
You can't even understand it until you go. And if you go, you'll be like, oh, because there's a lot of the next generation that come up that hate this country and they think that it's a terrible place. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of things that we should always work to improve. Good human beings should want to improve things, right? But if you think this place is bad, you need to travel. But like I was saying, I witnessed people literally dying on the side of the road. They couldn't get water. Yep. And it was the first time I ever experienced. Me and one of my pros were walking down the road, and there was a guy white foam on his mouth, looked like a Holocaust victim, and he didn't want money because we thought he wanted water. And me and Josh walked all the way back to the fighter hotel, and we're like, hey, we need a case of water for the fighters, which they don't care to us, of course. Oh yeah, no problem. We walked back and gave this guy a case of water, and we were sitting there, and we couldn't really communicate with him, obviously. Yeah. But as we continued our walk, we gave him the case of water. We were like, can you imagine that in America, there's people that might beg for your change. There might be this. We do have homelessness.
Yeah.
That man was dying of water on the side of the road,
Yep.
right? With nobody was caring for him in the world. And I'm like, man, just the way it restructures your brain about what we do have, what we take for granted, what we think hardship is.
Yes. Yeah.
You know
what
what
we
I mean?
think poverty is.
What we think poverty is. This dude was probably in his 50s, and like I said, looked like he had just come out of the Holocaust and was dying on the side of the road because he couldn't get a drink.
Yep.
And I'm like, man, life is insane. The way that you can be from on this side. And like I said, the weird thing about perspective is the girl that lives a super spoiled, entitled life that has everything handed to her, that experiences some form of trauma, to her, that is a trauma relative to what he is experiencing. Because to her brain, that's all she knows.
Yep.
And more people need to understand that, because I feel like a lot of times we write other people's struggles off without realizing, like, to them, that might be the same thing that causes that presence feeling, whatever you want to describe it as, that you were talking about, that gives them that emptiness in their limbic system that could lead to them taking their own life. And people might be like, well, that's just pathetic. You don't understand that to that human being, that was not pathetic.
Yep. Yeah, that was everything they could take.
So one of the things I want to talk about is usually people that I find that really have themselves together professionally and personally, they've gone through several moments in their life of character development or professional development. Do you remember any major sparks in your life that really, I mean, besides the one that you talked about was profound, where you said, like you were able to separate that day, and then you came back and you experienced laying in that bed and trying to get it figured out, and you had to restructure your brain. What do you think have been the most impactful things that have put you on the right track, that the man sitting here today, the Eric that exists now, can go like, I really have such a better grasp on reality? Besides the military service, was it, the birth of your children? Was it like, what have been the most profound things that have helped shape you as a man?
Right at the start of the military service, I had gotten engaged to my wife. We've been together like almost 30 years. We've been married 25. But right after college, I spent the summer there with her, and then I had to go into the military, and she was going to go off to medical school. And she drove out and dropped me off in San Diego to start my training. And then she left, and I was there in San Diego, and I realized, like, wow, I'm going to see her like maybe once or twice, but probably just once a year for like the next 4 years. And I was like, man, that was
how do you handle that?
I mean, that was a lonely moment. I was really down, and I think in that moment, I don't want to describe it as sort of quasi-religious terms, but I felt quite desperate. I felt desperately sad, and it was very specific. In other words, it wasn't a long build-up. It wasn't that I had been in a downward spiral, but I, in that moment, experienced something fairly profound where I just remember sort of lying there, and I remember sort of thinking or saying, help me, to nobody in particular, just sort of saying, I gave myself up to this. I was like, I can't deal with this emotion. And then this sort of sense of not peace, but maybe competence or agency, where suddenly it was like, well, this is going to be hard, but like, I can do this. And I don't really know. I mean, so was that God? I don't know. Was that just my brain responding to a stress and just giving me a little chemical hit? I don't really know. But it was curious, and it really was a moment where I sort of shifted then, and I think I became much more of an adult at that point, and much more of okay, I've got some business to take care of. We got to do some Navy stuff. Let's go.
You found strength within yourself in that moment.
Yeah, and there was. And there were a couple times during my Navy service where I was, pushed by some leaders who were not doing the best, and they'd created situations where, I don't know how to describe it exactly. It's sort of a long story, but it's sort of some sort of combination of kind of like bullying and toxic leadership, and one way or another, we ended up in the middle of the Persian Gulf at 2:00 in the morning with a senior officer giving me an order that I didn't feel I could follow. I disobeyed a direct order in a combat zone, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And that was a bit of risky business. But I got away with it because there's some complex rules about how these different I was an officer of the deck, and there's specific rules that govern because I'm controlling the ship, and that's very dangerous if that's done incorrectly. So, I mean, I guess you could say I got away with it a technicality, but I don't think it was a technicality. I think it was that this other individual was really just not doing their job well and was asking me to do something he should have known wasn't allowed, but because it was kind of being a bully. So I guess it was a moment where I was called upon to stand my ground against a bully in a military sense, where court martial was a very real possibility, and my enlisted team that watched me do it, they were distraught because they thought that I had committed like ritual career suicide right in front of them. But that was a real growth point for me because I realized that I had, I mean, there's a lot of, when you realize that you can stand up to the bully, when you realize that you can stand your ground, that's really empowering. And so that was a big moment.
That's incredibly powerful because there's going to be a lot of moments in your life, whether you're in the military or not. But if you're in the military, it could be countless lives on the line in that. Whereas if you know deeply within yourself that the right decision here, regardless of, because like when you said disobey a direct order, there are some human beings that regardless of whether they think the next choice is right or wrong, or other people may or may not be harmed, they will, well, I have to follow the authority. And I would challenge people to not be those people. If you believe firmly enough, and first of all, if you have a good moral compass and you have a strong foundation within yourself and you know that you're going to stand the ground on the right side of things, you should stand your ground. But I tell you what, that's a difficult thing to do. And that takes a lot of strength of character to put your foot down. And I bet you there was some form of like, even though there's all this stress and all this, I will fight this to the end. You have to have a certain level of confidence of like, no, I will carry this out to the end. Otherwise, the bully is hoping that you crumble.
Yes.
That's how bullies work.
Yeah.
There are no bullies in this academy ever. Because you don't walk into a gym with professional fighters and try to bully people, right? People do it through authority or through fear or through threat of consequence. But when you know that, like, listen, I know who I am. I'm a part of this too. I know the ground I stand on, and I'm not backing down.
Yeah.
I challenge more people to do it. I love hearing that.
Yeah, that was a challenge. And then I think the other one, as you mentioned too, was when
one last thing before we leave that. Once you stood up to that man, which is, like you said, was a huge thing at the time. They thought you might be in front of the court martial. Did you find even more strength within yourself after that moment because you stood up to a
absolutely. When I came back onto the bridge for the next watch with a team that didn't think they'd ever see me again, they started clapping, which was just tremendous, right? They just loved it. And people would joke about it for years afterwards. The nice part was that it wasn't just me; it was everybody who was doing my job had been getting beaten up by the specific group of senior officers who were doing a job that was sort of that was a temporary. It was a job that existed only because we were in the combat zone, and it was an important job that needed to be done, and it should have been done in concert with these two. What was happening was these were senior. Anytime there was a mistake, they were blaming it on the junior, which is kind of a cop-out, even when they were creating the problems themselves. That just became a huge morale buster. And what happened was I was kind of like the David who had gone up against the Goliath. And so that changed the dynamic. First of all, everybody else took great solace from the fact that I had vanquished my Goliath. But then it also changed the dynamic where it forced everybody to realize, hey, there's some BS that's going on here.
This is more of a level playing field than we thought, and you directly empowered every other person that may not have had the courage to stand up like that. So that's a profound moment, and you've seen that throughout examples throughout history. Sometimes it only takes one person to go, no, despite what the law says, despite what the court martial might say, no. And you know what? You showed strength of character in that moment that I bet you had major ripples upon the people around you.
Yeah, it was a moment. I mean, in the hours after that, before the reckoning came, and then I was finally cleared. It was an interesting couple of hours as I sat alone in my stateroom, going like, have I gone too far this time? Is this going to end poorly for me?
Character growth isn't always easy, you know what I mean? But you know what? It's usually worth it. Like I said, especially if you stand on a good foundation within yourself. You know what I mean? I believe we should take a stance.
And then maybe watching, I think the other one was watching my children be born. I'm a big fan of my wife. But just something about watching someone create another human being, and just, she's one of these interesting ones where she didn't make any sounds when she gave birth. And she's a doctor. So when the hospital nurses find out there's a doctor giving birth, they always come and kind of spy and see like how the doctor's sort of handling her business. And it was just so funny because everybody kept coming in. She's like, oh, there's a doctor on ward 2 and she's giving birth to an 11-pound kid with no drugs and she's not making any sound. And it was almost like my wife was a like an exhibit in a
stoic, man.
Circus or something. People wanted to come see this unusual performance.
They're like, do something.
Yes.
Well, how are you handling it so well? That's shout out to the wife.
Yeah.
And you guys have been together. So this is the same woman that when you went out, and went to base for the first time, and you said, "I'm not going to be able to handle this relationship." Here you are today.
Yeah.
Man, that's incredible.
That's pretty neat. Yeah.
That's really great to hear. So one of the topics that I also want to make sure we cover in this podcast is in this new generation, I feel like the way that we convey information, the way that we teach people is going to be a dynamic that may be changing. Because back in the day, there was so much less entertainment. There was so much less distraction. Nowadays, you have kids learning from TikTok and these quick videos. Everybody's getting these like quick little information clips without really source checking or anything like that, but there's information readily available. You being a college professor, you are getting to see the next minds on the come up. Do things seem different inside of schools nowadays versus how they were? I don't necessarily think it has to be bad or good, but just how are things different on like education for the future generations? Like, the kids that are coming up now, what do we have to do to reach these children to make sure that we create the best, healthiest psychological people to move our world forward?
Yeah, that's a big ask. I mean, people have been on a decade by decade basis for the last 100+ years. There have been all kinds of people who look at education, talk about how it needs to change, talk about how important it is for the nation. So I mean, you could go back and find you some quotes talking about how, when we were replacing chalkboards with whiteboards, and people were complaining about, well, what are you going to do without the chalk? Actually using paper and pencil rather than chalkboards. And the educators at the time, some of them decrying this newfangled paper and how are they going to do. And so, or you could find, when movies were first coming out, they would say, oh, well, now that movies are here, we don't need teachers anymore because the movies will make all teaching obsolete. So
that just seems so silly because it's just technology. I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, it is. As the technologies come in and as people talk about needing to change things or whatever, in the end, teaching at its simplest to me is a dyad, right? I am here, you are here, I have something to teach you, or you have something to teach me. We work on it together. When you look at any kind of educational intervention, or if you want someone to learn something quickly, there's nothing better than literally the Socratic method of Aristotle studying at the feet of Plato, or Plato studying at the feet of Socrates, and learning and passing it down one-on-one. That's such a powerful dyad. Now, does that work for the sort of industrial level schooling we're trying to do? Maybe not. But that's sort of the gold standard. You don't get a whole lot better than that, because that teacher then knows everything about where you're at, only has to deal with your misconceptions, only has to deal with your mental state, only has to inspire you. Then all of a sudden you make it 5 kids, or in some inner city schools, 40 or 45 kids at once. That's too much, right? So if you want to talk about like what's the best way to teach people, add and take away as much technology as you want. You just need well-trained, adequately funded teachers in safe physical spaces, dealing with really no more than about 25. If you talk to most people who teach professionally, they don't want to have less than 5, even less than 10. Less than 10, it gets a little too weird, it's a little too small. Somewhere between 10 and 20. And then maybe you stretch it to 25 for the really good teachers. But even the really good teachers who, I've seen teachers who can maintain control of 50, but they're not getting done what they want to get done. Once you hit 25, most teachers who know what they're doing will say, that's enough. Actually, I don't need any more students. If I have to take them, I will. But every student you add is going to detract in some way from here on out. And there's some research you can back this up, but this is like anecdotal. So, you have smaller classrooms, safe, well-trained teachers, and then sure, you can harness like TikTok as a way to kind of capture their attention, sure. But I think the principles of like good teaching and teaching in depth about important subjects, it's never so much about the TikTok. I mean, that like giving them the task of creating a TikTok as a way of showing what they've learned, that could be useful, right? One
So
of the
you kind of believe in the simplicity. You believe in not, I mean, the teaching methods have been around for a long period of time, and it's simpler than we have to make it. It's just about that personal interaction from a trusted
yeah,
standpoint. And you know what I mean? And first of all, the student has to have some level of respect or admiration for the instructor
100%,
to be perceptible to the information, right?
absolutely.
That's like a huge thing, because if you have that breakdown there, like if I have respect for you, I'm way more willing to listen to the information that you present me. I
Yeah.
mean, etc.
And I say in my class when I would teach in the teacher prep program, I would say teaching is leadership, right? If you're going to teach, you're going to be the leader in that classroom. And one of the precepts of leadership is this John Paul Jones thing, right? Is a great quote. If you would seek to be perfectly obeyed, seek first to be perfectly esteemed. And that is literally the cornerstone. When I teach leadership, that is the cornerstone of my lectures for leadership. Because again, if your men and women admire you and think you are a good person and trust you, they will generally follow your orders. If the reverse is the case, generally you're lost then. If they don't have respect for you, if they don't think that your orders are sound, if they don't think your judgment is sound, you can give orders all you want, and they may give surface compliance, but then as soon as you turn your back, it's
100%. You see this in work environments where the boss is just a tyrant, and yet like they might be getting compliance, but they're getting it at such a bottom of the barrel
yeah,
level until there's alternate
yeah,
sources or options. And they're living in a state of usually being unhappy and unfulfilled, which is going to make them a lesser version of themselves unless they go through character growth and stuff like that. But you're not helping your team, you're not helping your program, you're not helping your students if you are not demanding excellence in leadership out of yourself.
yep,
Because if there's that breakdown, you're going to keep them at that level. That's one thing that I've thought a lot about the education in this country. The best thing that we could do is find the best educators
yep.
and then set up a system to support those
Yeah,
people.
you can look at other countries that have much better results than we do, and what you'll see is, for example, teachers are uh, a profession sort of on par with an EMT, or not quite a doctor, but a CPA or something, where it's considered a profession. You have to train for it, and they pay, right? So teachers would be, the entering salary would be something like $70,000 as opposed to like 30,000 like it is here, and so it's a different game. And so you attract the right people, and you create the kind of demand, and you create the kind of pressure to sort of do good work, that again it would be very costly, but it's it's, it's about priorities. What are you going to spend your money on?
And you're
So
going to get results. And at the end of the day, if you're offering a $70,000 salary, you're going to have a way bigger sphere of influence on the people that would like to be teachers. So then you can be selective of the
sure,
right people. You can get
right,
higher caliber human beings.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and I remember as a kid growing up thinking, oh, especially as I got into my teens and my early 20s, like I grew up with a lot of people that are now teachers, and I see people that were kind of this level that are now teachers, and I see people that really are phenomenal human beings, super intelligent, that are teachers. And I always thought, in a society that's trying to be as healthy and successful as possible, why wouldn't police and teachers and these other really crucial roles be super selective of, like, let's put our best.
yes,
Let
absolutely,
let's have our best. Not the super angry mess that's all over the place that doesn't get respect from the students, that's trying
yeah,
to be an instructor. You know what I
yeah,
mean? It should be a selective thing. But like you said, it's very costly. It's a difficult system. But really, if we wanted to affect the future generation, the better teachers we put in place, the better students we're going to have come out of it.
yeah,
It's a if-then formula.
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
So just man, Eric, we've captured over an hour of dialogue. It's been outstanding. Anything else, like in your current life, with your roles within the University of Michigan, with your goals? Because, like, I mean, you've done tremendous things in your life. I'm gonna link your bio at the end of this podcast for people to look at. But you could talk about, do you still have any goals that you are working towards that keep you striving in the future? Are there certain issues or topics that you feel like you've really spearheaded or taken on? Just anything else you'd like to talk about, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, I guess my closing thought would be to kind of tie back to some of the things we talked about. The thing that really helped me get out of my own funk and my own whole sort of coming out of that final Iraq deployment was, actually, I noticed that helping others helped me feel better. And I started to simply look for opportunities to help others, or to start to say yes to these things. And so what happened is, when people look at my LinkedIn, for example, they're like, wait, but like there are like 19 of these things that are all still active. Like they say to present, you can't still be doing all these. And I'm like, well, actually, I am. Now, I don't do all of them every day, all day, and I do those things, but I've built teams of really solid people, in a lot of cases volunteers, who help me do those things. So I don't do those things alone, but I do make sure those things get done because those are roles I took on that I feel are providing a valuable service for others. So um, my big thing would be, I guess, asking folks to consider, as I do with my students, it's never too early in your life to sort of look around and say, how can I invest my time, talent, or treasure in the progress and benefit of others? Because that not only really, when we talk about things that are like prophylactic against depression or whatever, that's a big one. And I think in some ways that kind of service, I think, kind of saved my life. And my wife sometimes says, like, why like when I recently accepted another gig, doing some volunteer stuff. And she's like, is it paid? And then she's like, never mind, don't answer that, right? Because I'm very successful. I don't need any more money, but I want to do good things. Here was an opportunity to really do some cool stuff and affect a lot of people. Um, and so, you know, and obviously you can, once you're retired, you have more time, but even when you're young, you have time to donate blood or to spend 2 hours a week. Go try that, because what happens is when you get your first little hit of that drug, if you will, you're like, oh, I like how this feels. And it can be one of those things where it becomes now a part of what you do on a daily or regular basis. And it really, there's a decent amount of research in positive psychology, for example, that talks about when you look at the people who are the happiest and the most fulfilled, one of the things that's common to them is that they spend a decent amount of time. They're a little more grateful. They're more obviously and openly grateful about their situation, and they express gratitude. But the other thing is that they're very consistently involved in either work or volunteer efforts to benefit others. So they have the purpose in their life, but they're actually investing themselves in making the world a better place. And that leads to this really high sense of satisfaction. And so when I think about the folks that are around me, that so many of the young people and the students that I deal with, they feel so much stress, they feel so overwhelmed, and I have to get them to sort of step back and say, you're 20, you're 21 years old. I know you feel like if you don't get into this one special program, your life is over, but I'm sorry to tell you, it's not over. You're going to live to be 100 years old. You're 20, right? You've got time. So take a deep breath. And then instead of being so obsessed about everything that you have to do, whatever, like step back and, go tutor at a school or do something where your skills can be used to help other people, because that's really going to lead to you being much more calm and happy with your existence. Because I see so many students striving so hard, having so much success at Michigan, which is a very high level, and yet they feel miserable and they feel lost and stressed and overwhelmed. And I just think, oh, this should not be this way. You should be having a better time. So, anyway, this idea of service to others as being a part of a life well lived, it is something my father tried to teach me, and he did plant that seed when I was younger. And I did a bunch of stuff, whether it was just giving blood with him or working with youth groups that would help in the inner city or Boy Scouts. It's always been a thing for me. It's been a thing, but it was never like a principle or a really an item that had to be on the checklist. And I think once I got really serious about having that be one of my things I focused on, my life got so much better. I just encourage everybody to give it a try, because for me it was quite revolutionary.
I've interviewed and know so many successful people, and they all say that same thing. Anyone that is happy and fulfilled, they all say that by pouring into the cups of others, you're actually pouring into your own cup.
Absolutely.
It's just success leaves clues. And when you see these people that have their lives together and they're all preaching that value, like you're a part of this human thing, whether you want to be or not, like you're a part of this human experience together. And at some point, you've probably experienced lows in your life. And when you can see other people that are experiencing lows and you can help pull them out of that, it gives you more of a sense of like, man, my actions matter. I made a difference there. And it's weird because you don't do it for you, but it causes happiness in you. You're doing it to try to help another human being, but it's absolutely accurate. I would challenge anyone that is a little bit down or a little bit overwhelmed or a little stressed to just try to, even if it is as small as being kind in the daily interactions that you have, even if it is as small as saying thank you very much to the people that you interact with and shaking someone's hand or giving someone a smile, those little things add up more. Maybe they add up to your subconscious. Maybe your subconscious starts to evaluate the human being that you are in this world and the impact that you make. But no matter what, for sure, I can tell you as someone that has tried to I bet you when that decision comes to you about, oh, do you want to be involved in this project? It's a no-brainer. You don't even think about it. You're like, of course, if I can make, and I'm the same way. And my fiance now didn't mess that up as of 3 weeks ago, fiance. And my fiance now will literally be like, oh my God, like you're gonna spread yourself more thin, but it's a no-brainer to me. I've done Reaching Higher program, I've done motivational speaking, I've done graduation speeches, I've done, when these things come up, I remember the feeling that it gave me afterwards because of the feeling that I saw that I gave others.
Yep. And you'll never know because I do this work at Michigan to create these programs for the student veterans, or I also work in the veteran treatment court. And over and over again, after like a year of offering things to people or providing things or whatever, and there'll be people who say, they'll come up to me as they're graduating and say, Dr. Fretz made such a difference in my life. And I'm like, I recall seeing you like 3 times. He's like, but every week you sent that email and I knew you were there if I needed you. I was like, great. But I just thought to myself, oh, I would never have imagined that I mattered at all to this person. And yet somehow, or, the other day, this was crazy. I heard a voice in the middle of Michigan's Diag saying, hey, hey. And I was walking along. I didn't realize it was me. And then this young man who'd been sort of running to catch me, he's a bigger fella, and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he's like, hey, you had a son who went to such academy, right? I was like, oh yeah, that was my son Mason. He's like, you were a substitute teacher. Well, see, I actually got qualified as a substitute teacher and then restricted my availability just to my kids' charter district, so I could only go to their schools and torture them because I like to be embarrassment to my children. So I used to substitute teach on occasion at my children's school. Well, and I was substituting one day, and I have a little lecture about personal finances that is very popular with the students. But anyway, this young man, and I gave it to his class of 7th graders or something. And so this was 6-7 years later. He's done with high school. He's in college, and he says, I'll never forget that lecture that you gave us, and it just changed how I looked at the world, and it gave me real serious about going to college, and now I'm here. And I was just looking at this kid, and I was like, wow, we all need to be so much more thoughtful about the energy we're putting into the world. And just this thing where I did this simple little thing I did for this class 7 years ago, and here's this individual now, and I was like, wow.
It is such a beautiful reminder that like your actions matter, and the to you, what could be the most minuscule, like, oh, I spent 10 minutes giving a speech that I've given 500 times. But to that kid, it was a profound moment that helped to restructure something in his brain and his perception and change the course of his life. So if we all got up in the morning and realized that like the way that I live today will impact the world around me, no matter what, no matter what, it's going to impact the world. So would I like to impact it in a positive way or a negative way?
Absolutely.
If we have these conversations more often and we realize that our impact matters, we're going to figure things out, because we're going to struggle, we're going to get knocked down, we're going to have division, we're going to have conflict. But if we all take like on my Facebook, my favorite quote I've ever read is, the greatest gift you have to give is that of your own personal transformation.
Okay.
And I love that, because it's like, if I don't first bring out the best in me, anything else I try to do is secondary. If I can be the best James that has ever existed, I'm going to have a stronger impact on my loved ones. I'm going to have a better impact in my business ventures. I'm going to have a better impact here. Versus if I'm always sitting there being like, oh, I wish this changed, or I wish that changed. You can start with you.
It's the phrase I use in my graduate class where I teach about emotional intelligence, and one of the phrases I teach them is fly your own plane first. Everything you do in the world is flying in unison with other planes. Be the plane that's well maintained, works well, isn't belching smoke, is competently piloted. Be that plane, and other planes will fly with you.
It's the exact same thing in just different wording.
Be the best plane. Yeah.
It's literally be your best self.
Yeah.
And if you do that, we will get the best existence, especially because one little individual best self is a beacon, and it radiates, and it allows energy to hit all of the ones around it, just like you use in that plane analogy. And then maybe those that are the closest to it all of a sudden start becoming a beacon for the other people. Yeah. And now one person's actions do change the world. And when you realize that, it gives you more of a sense of purpose, you know what I mean? And that can steer a lot of people. So Eric, it has been a phenomenal conversation today, and honor
great chat.
to sit and talk with you. If people wanted to reach out to you, if people are students at U of M or just anyone that wanted to contact you, is there a method that they could reach out to you? Do you use an email?
Yeah, I'm totally an email guy, so you can find me in the UM directory, but it's EB Fretz. So E is in Echo, B is in Bravo, my initials, and then the last name Fretz, Fretz at umich.edu. But I do all my work through email, much better than texting or any. You can find me on LinkedIn, and they have a separate system there. But I live my life through my email inbox. I have a very disciplined system. I'm a very busy guy, but I always will try and make time for anyone. So yeah.
I try not to ever stereotype ever, but I said, you know what? If I had to guess, this gentleman is an email person and he's got it in order, and I was right. All right. But truly, it was an honor to sit with you today. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks again. My pleasure.